Hello everyone. So today we'll be talking about content creation under a new creative paradigm from on-premises to cloud. That will be with me, your presenter Mark Knowles. I'm the General Manager of Creative Production at TAG for the Americas. And today what I wanted to talk about is creative production through the lens of the creative team rather than through an IT lens, so to speak. So what we're going to cover in the agenda today will be a little bit about who we are at TAG and Taylor James, our challenges that we faced that sort of led us down this path, out with the old, what was our old setup, and then how we evaluated the alternatives of that. We'll talk a little bit about running the numbers as well. We'll obviously talk about how we proved the model working from a functional perspective, how you launch the platform within our environment, and then what the numbers look like from a productivity perspective. We'll talk a little bit about future state and also a bit of a summary overall at the end. So about us. So Taylor James is a multidisciplinary creative production studio. We run the gamut of creative production from concept to completion across print, TV, digital, post, visual effects, interactive and creative development as well. And that really is the setup for this conversation because we have such a diverse array of creative production needs and so many questions that we need to answer when we're defining the way that we actually produce this content. And we're going to show a little bit of a show reel now about some of the work that we produce here at Taylor James. So you'll see it's a big combination of CGI, visual effects, animation, particle simulation, live action with 2D design animation integration. We do a lot of flame work, we do a lot of editorial work, post, color correction, and everything in between. And that puts a lot of stress and strain on our kind of creative production pipeline. And again, we'll be looking to answer those questions as we evaluate the platform that we've chosen to move forwards with. So as you can see, a tremendous amount of creative production content across many, many different platforms for sort of highly creative clients. So we are essentially 4 offices. We're across London, New York, Los Angeles and Mexico. We kind of run the full time zones really. We have a 17-hour workday effectively across all of those time zones, but it's really 4 offices and 1 platform as we look towards the future. We've been going for about 20 years now, since 1999. We actually started out as a print and retouch house doing very sort of high-end multi-part compositing, working with photographers. And then naturally, as we grew in terms of the creative production and requests that we had come through from our clients, we actually started to do a lot more CGI and visual effects. And that's where you see us today now with the full gamut of creative production capabilities. So some of the company that we keep. So, we work both with agencies and with brands directly. We have a lot of prominence within the luxury goods space, luxury product space. So you'll see a lot of automotive work in there, a lot of brands like Bose and Peloton, lots of automotive brands like Honda and Acura, but also all of the major creative agencies. We produce content alongside those guys in partnership. And, just in terms of locations, as we talked about, we actually have 4 major creative production hubs that deal with our kind of tier 1 work. But actually, Taylor James is part of a much bigger entity called TAG, who have offices around the world in both APAC, EMEA, and the Americas, and in LATAM as well. So again, as we think towards what our future state might look like, we're also considering integration with these other offices. So, what led us to this decision? So really, it was the perfect storm of events. As we all know, we've had a lot of challenges over the last 18 months with COVID, and that's very much put a focus on shifting our production ways of working and how we actually produce content across the globe. That's really changed the paradigm from the outset. However, Taylor James has some unique challenges as well that were a culmination of rapid expansion. So we actually had aging on-premises hardware across 4 of our sites, which had quite costly and lengthy service contracts with, whether that's an MPLS network, or whether that's, storage providers, or whether that's, kind of tape libraries. They all come with lengthy service contracts, and they were all coming up for renewal at a similar time. We had prohibitive problems in place with cross-site workshare. So that's a challenge. We've obviously got a global workforce that's on 24/7, and we want them to be able to work together where possible. And we had differing physical implementations of our hardware setup. One site might have been slightly different or had slightly older hardware than another site. One had a slightly different storage array than another, which made syncing and moving data back and forward quite challenging. And of course, we're getting downward pressure coming from agencies and brands that want it quicker, better, cheaper. And that's all underpinned by a really, really solid hardware infrastructure. And of course, our different sites had different needs. For example, our EMEA operations do a tremendous amount of automotive work, which requires very, very big scalability and ramp up. And some of our Mexico sites required, very, very quick turn projects that were much smaller. And then New York kind of covered everything in between. So slightly different needs across the globe. So out with the old. So our old setup was, kind of antiquated, like we said. We did really well with hardware resilience thanks to a tremendous IT team who had managed to keep uptime, very, very close up to 95% uptime across the whole network. However, that meant that there was also aging infrastructure that we hadn't invested in and needed to replace to address some of the issues on the previous slide. So each site had very similar foundations in terms of their architecture, but they definitely had individual hardware technologies. And rapid expansion in the Americas. When I moved over to the Americas in 2012, we rapidly expanded very, very quickly. And that didn't necessarily give us the lead times to set everything up in the same way that London was set up, which was kind of our original headquarters. So rapid growth put a lot of strain on our infrastructure. And sites were being connected over a very expensive MPLS network, which trafficked dedicated bandwidth between the sites. And that has its own challenges. It's got unavoidable costs. It's got an inability to relocate those because it's a physical pipe going into a physical building. So moving and growing our building footprint as our team grew was really, really difficult. And my favorite anecdote, so when I first moved over to the US in 2012 to set up the New York office, that rapid expansion came very, very quickly. And one of our first jobs was a huge job which required a massive amount of render. So we hopped on eBay. We bought 64 of the best M1000E Dell render blades that we could. And we spent about $40,000 on those render blades. And up until April of this year, 9 years later, those were still in use. They hadn't failed once. And in fact, the only failure that we had was when we disassembled that chassis to move it to AWS. So I think that level of resilience that the IT team had managed to achieve was fantastic. But those render blades definitely have a very sort of strong place in my heart, as you can see the picture on the right-hand side. We had widespread challenges with upgrading machine images as well due to regional restrictions. So our London team had specific hardware and software that was dedicated towards automotive. And then our New York team had a very different set of software requirements, which meant pushing the same image across all sites was really difficult. So we wouldn't be able to share work because there were different software requirements per site. And then, of course, we had large quantities, massive quantities in creative production of data that were decentralized across different storage pools. And the ability to sync that back and forth in order to be able to share production was nigh and impossible for us. I think we were talking somewhere in the region of probably 1,000 terabytes minimum of data. So what did we look for? This was the lens through which we evaluated every decision, and it was about a centralized production model for a very decentralized production paradigm. So what do I mean by that? Well, if we want to move to a model where all of our teams can work together holistically without geography being a barrier, we wanted to make sure that the solution that we put in place could enable that work share. However, we have a very decentralized production model now because everybody can sit at home and work independently. They don't need to be in an office. They don't need to be even in the country that you're producing the content in. They can be anywhere in the world. So we had kind of almost two opposing requests. We wanted something to be really centralized with an incredibly decentralized team. So I'm not going to dive into every single one of these, but we went through a lengthy process of evaluating all of the options. So we looked at obviously the pros and cons of on-premises. We looked at the pros and cons of a hybrid cloud approach, which was a mixture of cloud and on-premises. And we also looked at the 100% cloud option. Obviously, where we netted out was the 100% cloud option. So sorry for the spoilers, but we obviously went with AWS in the long run. But it was really important to evaluate all of our options. We had a great experience with hardware on-premises, very reliant, very resilient. But as I said, some of those negatives, the huge CapEx costs, the very, very sort of unbalanced infrastructure across all of our sites, and a very expensive MPLS networks and service contracts to maintain that were very expensive. However, it was a much lighter lift for our IT team if we wanted to remain with on-premises hardware. The option to move to a hybrid cloud was to say, right, well, let's take the best of on-premises hardware, let's keep our workstations locally, but let's maybe move our storage into the cloud, or let's maybe move our workstations into the cloud that we use to burst up into freelancers, or maybe move our render into the cloud. And that was a much lighter lift for the team. It meant we got to keep some of our original hardware. However, it meant that obviously we would get the benefit of scalability within the cloud. The reality was, and for a very, very apparent reason shortly, we couldn't go with that route. Where we actually netted out was the 100% cloud option. And that was primarily driven by a bigger business decision to reduce our physical premises footprint from a real estate perspective as COVID hit. We made a very, very sort of progressive decision as a business to say, okay, we aren't going to go back into the office now from a creative production perspective, so we aren't going to need that on-premises equipment and hardware anymore. So we went full out with 100% cloud. The net result of that was actually a tremendous amount of pros that probably we didn't even foresee up front. But we had zero maintenance contracts moving everything into AWS. We had complete burst capacity and the ultimate scalability to grow our team into AWS at the drop of a hat. We had, a great ability to iterate all of the work that we do from a render perspective. If we needed to kick off a render and get it back really quickly, well, we could do that, and we could improve and constantly update the creative very, very quickly. It completely overnight revolutionized our inability to image our machines on premises. We actually had custom machine images from the get-go that we were able to just push out to AMI images in AWS, which was fantastic. And it presented us the ability to have global reach. We could use the right person for the right job in the right time zone, and they could all work seamlessly together, sitting alongside one another virtually. It also meant we could tap into our global license pool, and it also had a huge performance leap versus the current infrastructure. So obviously, as I was talking about, 9-year-old eBay render blades that had done a tremendous job for us, they were now updated to the latest hardware that Amazon had to provide, and that saw huge upticks, or actually reductions, in render time for us. There were some downsides. We recognised that you can't always do supervised sessions in the cloud for Flame or Colour. Editorial was another matter though, that's definitely pushed forwards. We were concerned about unpredictable kind of OPEX spend. That's obviously a big concern with many people. They're not sure about what the cloud actually costs. And also control over artists. We don't want artists just spinning up 1,000 workstations at the drop of a hat because that obviously has an impact from a cost perspective. And obviously there was a harder or a bigger lift for our IT teams and for our pipeline teams as well. And a bit of a fear of the unknown. A very progressive move in the creative production world to completely take your main headquarters in New York and move them into the cloud at the drop of a hat. And also, what if the internet breaks? How do you access your data? How do you get in there? And how can you continue to produce content? Well, fortunately, their uptime is as good as ours has been over the past 20 years, so we've had no problems with that. So I do want to run through a little bit of a demo because this is really where it comes, really what it comes down to. So what we're using here is a combination of 3 specific tools. We're using the AWS VPN client, which is a single sign-on client which enables our teams to log into the AWS VPN. That gives them essentially access to the North Virginia data center that we're using to spin up our machines. We're also using a tool called Managed Studio, which is written by a chap called Dan Marshall, who is very sort of prominent within the creative production space. And he's developed this tool which enables our artists to spin up their instances at the start of the day. So they launch the VPN, they come into Managed Studio, they're able to build out their G4DN large X instance, and that basically entitles them to 64 gigs of RAM and 16 cores, and that's their workstation for the day. They can copy that IP address, dump it into NiceDCV, which is another AWS product, but it's essentially a software a screen sharing client. It gives them a remote desktop into their AWS machine. And as you can see here, in the time it takes me to talk about spinning it up, I think it's 2 minutes, 20 seconds or something like that, the team have got their machine spun up and it's available to be logged onto. Completely secure, completely controllable. If we wanted to update this image in the morning, we could trash it, and by the time you come in the next morning, you can have an updated piece of software, or you can have an updated license of something. Everything is very controllable from a centralized kind of repository that AWS provides. And this was one of the biggest concerns from our creative production team, from our artists, was, well, am I going to get a fast machine? Am I going to be able to log into it quickly? Is it going to feel like I'm working on a workstation under the desk? Well, the resounding feedback so far has been very much yes. So really, really exciting developments for us. And this enables us, this process here enables us to take what used to be a 7-day lead time on getting a rental workstation to put under somebody's desk on premises. It's now a 2-hour tops, and that's just more of our IT team to spin up an instance, provision it, and send out the information to the user. So launching the platform is incredibly easy. And I wanted to show, like, proving the model. This is the type of work that we're producing in the platform. We're using all of those instances we talked about. We're using the render capacity. We're using incredibly fast storage. We actually have a 30 terabyte Pixstore Engineer that is basically incredibly fast, has amazing throughput. And part of the reason that's really important for us is that when you're dealing with the types of jobs that you're seeing here, this is a full CG computer animation with full CG lighting, full CG simulation, full CG render and compositing. All of this is done in the cloud, and it's all enabled by the cloud as well. We wouldn't have been able to simulate this data on our previous infrastructure. This is hundreds of gigs of simulation data for many of these effects that you're seeing for this Cole Haan piece. So great infrastructure development from our team's perspective in terms of performance. And I love this quote from our Executive Creative Director, Jay Harwood. I think this came probably a week after we'd actually launched the platform. There was a lot of apprehension. And he said to me, you know, it feels like being back in the studio again, and it feels like we're a team. Creative collaboration is very much back on the menu. That for me was the icing on the cake of the launch. We set about this process on April the 16th, or sorry, back in the end of February, and we launched it on April the 16th. And for us to be able to launch our main headquarters in New York into AWS in probably the best part of 6 weeks was a tremendous feat, and to get this level of feedback was incredible. And I just want to take a moment and sort of take a look through some of the numbers as well. So what have we done since we started rendering on the platform? So we've had 2,300 jobs submitted. to Deadline, which is an AWS client owned by ThinkBox, and basically that manages all of our rendering technology. And then in AWS specifically, we've actually rendered nearly 150,000 individual frames of computer animation. 60,000 of those frames were rendered through Maya, and about another 68,000 frames were rendered through Nuke as well, which is a compositing application. And we've clocked about 86 days of total render time since April the 16th. That's about 350 days of total task rendering, and we've written about 3.2 terabytes of data, and there's about 500 terabytes of our data in Deep Archive. We've actually pushed our whole archive into AWS. No more tapes, no more submitting an inquiry to or a request to IT, a support ticket to get files and footage restored. It's all there in Deep Archive. So from a future state perspective, what does it look like as we move forward? We've had this great successful rollout in New York. Well, now what we need to do is we need to roll this out to other major locations. So LA is already in progress, Mexico will be next, and then the UK will follow. We'll want to put a bigger reliance on utilizing GPU and real-time rendering. There's definitely more instances coming out by the day in AWS that enable that, which is awesome. We actually have a lot of our own pipeline tools that are chain of custody based, so we can actually leverage AWS's API to automate many of those processes and kind of power them from a compute perspective. One of the nice things about the move from CapEx into OpEx spend is actually that your actuals for your project, rendering, artist time, compute time, storage time, they're all true now. They're all physical numbers that you can actually put against a job because you've got an amazing API in the back end that you can tap into through the AWS console and say, this cost is associated with this job. And that's tremendous for us because we've got better clarity over our costs. Pipeline automation is huge. We can use the compute power of AWS to automate many of our huge projects for automotive, which is tremendous. We talked about the archive already, and we talked about the reduction in service contracts. This has probably netted us a saving of about $100,000 since April 16th alone. And remote sessions are on the menu. So as brands and businesses and production companies have more requirements for still doing remote sessions supervised with their clients, we're seeing software such as Flame or Premiere or DaVinci being able to support these remote sessions through AWS. So one of the things that I wanted to talk about very briefly was the takeaways. So the key takeaways for us were that it was a perfect storm of challenges which made our choice far easier. Being kicked out of our building or making the decision to move out of our building, and also with the older infrastructure, it was a perfect storm. It made our decision easy. We've had a net saving of about $350,000 over 3 years of CapEx versus the CapEx equivalent. So it's actually very price competitive, and that doesn't include the cost that we would save with our service contract reductions. And the costs are comparable, if not cheaper, than on-premises over the same period, but without the need for costly CapEx. Not everybody has $1 million to dump into CapEx at the drop of a hat. And costs are predictable and they're controllable as well. If you put the right stipulations in place with your staff, they can't spin up 1,000 blades. You can control the costs very easily, and they're very predictable. We predicted a cost up front in terms of what we thought it was going to cost, and it's coming in very, very close to that every single month. And major players are moving into the cloud, both in software and in post-production, and it truly enables a global workforce, which is so important. And one of the things that has actually launched since us launching our own AWS platform, AWS has actually launched Nimble Studio. That's actually amazing because it reduces the barrier to entry for much smaller businesses that maybe they don't have the pipeline team, or maybe they don't have a consultant to help them spin this up. Nimble Studio is kind of a one-stop shop for somebody to be able to go and do that. And newest hardware all the time. Anybody that works in creative production knows that artists just love new shiny toys, right? They want the most render power, the most memory capacity, the most throughput, the most real-time GPU rendering capability that they can get, and you get that for free essentially as you pay for your instance with AWS. And I think that the major thing for us is that the team will be thrilled with the work-life balance. Our team is saving 1.5 hours every morning and every evening in their commutes. They're investing some of that time back into the business. They're much happier. They're spending time with their families. They're there at home ready to eat dinner with their families. For us, that was a major driver as to the decision as to why we moved into the cloud. And finally, it was a centralized production model for a decentralized production workforce. We can go and tap into any talent anywhere in the globe. And with the implementation that we've built, it's seamless. It's perfect. So all in all, really, really positive benefits to moving the business into the cloud. Overall, just want to take a moment to say thank you. Really appreciate you taking the time to review this presentation with me. And if I had one last parting word, it would be definitely get on the AWS cloud bandwagon for sure.